Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. We've got a truly fascinating one for you today. We are going to be dissecting a very specific and honestly heavily debated political trend. We're going to take an objective look at a recent Fox News segment that tried to answer a pretty complex question. Why exactly is democratic socialism gaining so much traction among young voters? By looking at the insights from their panel, we're going to map out the exact psychological, economic, and cultural arguments that they presented. Let's dive right in. To really set the stage here, the segment kicks things off by establishing the massive political stakes surrounding this ideology. They feature this exact quote from Donald Trump. He says, "America will never be a socialist country. Together we will defeat communism, socialism, and Marxism in America once and for all." So right out of the gate, the baseline for this segment is made crystal clear. There is a fierce, deeply rooted resistance to socialist ideology in American politics. For the people having this discussion, the stakes literally couldn't be higher. But, that intense resistance leads us directly to our core question for today. If the pushback from major political figures is so absolute, why does the panel see a growing appeal for this ideology, specifically when it comes to younger demographics? To help answer that, the hosts bring in psychotherapist Jonathan Alpert. They bring him on to discuss the premise of his new op-ed, really trying to unpack the why behind this whole trend. So let's start with layer 1, the mind, the psychological argument. Albert's core thesis here is that the messaging behind socialism is, in his words, incredibly seductive to young people. And why is that? Well, according to his clinical perspective, it simply feels good. He argues that it gives individuals an easy out, a way to shift the blame for their life's challenges, problems, and shortcomings entirely onto external forces, onto the system, rather than actually having to look inward. It allows them to avoid looking at personal choices, individual responsibility, or what they might need to step up and do to achieve success on their own. To anchor this argument scientifically, Alpert brings in a clinical term from psychology. It's called the locus of control. Basically, this concept measures how much a person feels they have agency and control over the outcomes in their own life, compared to the belief that their outcomes are just driven by outside external factors that are totally beyond their influence. This gives you a really good visual of the divide Alpert is talking about. So on one side, you have an internal locus of control. That's the belief that hard work actually pays off and that individual responsibility dictates your future. Then on the flip side is the external locus of control. This is all about blaming the system and focusing on circumstances that are supposedly beyond your control. Now, Alpert makes a very explicit claim in this segment. He asserts that individuals who feel they have an internal locus of control, people who feel they have agency, actually do much better in life than those who feel everything is external. And he claims that the seduction of socialism leans heavily into this external mindset, where people find comfort in just blaming others for their problems.
Okay, moving right along to layer 2, the economy, a shift in reality.
Now, it's interesting because host Rachel actually steps in here to concede a really important point. She acknowledges that the economic landscape has fundamentally shifted. When you look at the era of 1999 compared to today, she admits that it is structurally so much harder for young people to get a start in life now than it was in the past. It's not just in their heads, right? There are real, tangible economic changes at play here.
To really put this into perspective and visually validate this economic starkness, Rachel shares a very specific personal anecdote. Back in 1999, at the age of 28, she and her husband bought their very first house for exactly $60,000. 60 grand. I mean, she notes how completely impossible that feels today. And by doing that, she validates that young voters absolutely have legitimate gripes about how hard it is to build a foundation. Times genuinely are tough out there.
But the panel quickly pivots to push back against the proposed socialist solutions to those economic gripes. This is a crucial point in their argument, how they view the practical application of this ideology. The hosts, along with Alpert, argued that replacing individual freedom, which they basically equate with capitalism, with government-controlled collectivism, just isn't going to solve issues like housing or wages. To prove this, they cite a hyper-local example, Mamdani's grocery store in New York, which restricts access so it's open only to New Yorkers. The panel points to this kind of exclusion as a perfect microcosm of what happens when collectivism is actually put into practice. They argue it ultimately fails to improve people's lives.
Which brings us to our final layer. Layer 3, the culture, social drivers and indoctrination.
Here, hosts Charlie and Rachel outline what they view as a two-step educational pipeline that they say normalizes this entire ideology. Step 1, according to Rachel, is this intense indoctrination that isn't just happening in college anymore. It's actually taking root at a much, much younger age. Then step 2, as Charlie points out, happens at the university level. He argues that higher education institutions have shifted away from teaching practical problem-solving and instead focus heavily on moral posturing. Charlie actually expands on this with a pretty fascinating quote from the clip. He says, if you wrap politics around moral posturing, you wind up with a bunch of people who aren't chasing important solutions, they're just wanting to demonstrate that, oh, look at me, I'm so right about this. Basically, the panel is arguing that modern politics for young people has just become a tool for social signaling. It's a way to show your peers that you're a good person, rather than actually being a pragmatic method for chasing down important societal solutions.
Alpert chimes back in here to list the social drivers that make this movement so incredibly attractive on a cultural level. He says it's not just about policy, it's a social code. It gives people this profound kinship and a real sense of community. You can see this in events like the recent No Kings rallies in New York. But crucially, he points out that it unites people against a shared enemy. Whether that target is Donald Trump or just broadly wealthy people, it gives young people a collective adversary that they can bond over.
And the segment wraps up with the panel sharing a slightly humorous concluding observation about that whole shared enemy concept. They point out what they see as a pretty big irony within the movement. While socialist platforms are incredibly vocal about their absolute disdain for the wealthy, the political figures leading these movements still readily accept a whole lot of donations from those exact same wealthy individuals. So all of this leaves us with a final, really provocative thought to take away from our explainer today. Based on the Fox News panel's entire dissection of the topic, we kind of have to ask ourselves, is the growing appeal of democratic socialism primarily driven by a generation's desperate desire to fix a broken economic system, a system where a $60,000 house is just a relic of the past? Or, like the psychotherapist argues, is it largely a psychological need to embrace an external locus of control, essentially avoiding individual responsibility by disblaming the system? It's a fascinating duality presented by the panel, for sure. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to always keep seeking out those structural layers behind the headlines. See you next time.